Off the coast of West Africa, near Cape Lopez, a pirate captain lay dying on the deck of his own ship, and the vessel that killed him was not truly the one that fired the shot. His name was Bartholomew Roberts, the most successful pirate captain of the entire golden age of piracy, a man credited with taking more ships than any other captain who ever raised a black flag. On this particular morning, he was not chasing prey, and he was not defending stolen treasure. His ship was careened, tipped onto its side on a stretch of open coast, hull exposed to open air, crew scattered and half drunk from a night of celebration, because that hull had been eaten through by something smaller than a finger and could not be ignored any longer. A creature, barely visible to the naked eye at the start of its life, had done what no rival captain, no storm, and no naval patrol had managed to do for years. It had forced the deadliest pirate of his generation into the one position from which he could not fight back. Within minutes, a Royal Navy warship rounded the point, caught him exposed and unable to maneuver, and ended his career with a single broadside. The official story calls this misfortune. The fuller story is stranger, because the true enemy that morning was never really the Royal Navy at all. This is the story of the Shipworm, a creature that never carried a weapon, never boarded a vessel, and never fired a single shot, and yet is responsible for more lost ships across human history than every pirate, storm, and naval battle combined. It bankrupted colonies, humbled empires, and quietly shaped the outcome of conflicts that history books credit entirely to cannon fire and courage. Every pirate captain knew that his greatest enemy was not the Navy hunting him, or the rival crew waiting to betray him. It was already living inside his own ship, chewing through the one thing standing between his crew and the bottom of the ocean. Rulers spent staggering sums trying to outsmart it. And to this day, the same creature is still boring through wooden piers, historic wrecks, and harbor pilings around the world, entirely indifferent to nations, treaties, or reputations. By the end of this video, you will understand why a soft-bodied creature smaller than a pencil did more damage to the Age of Sail than any admiral or any pirate who ever lived, and why the golden age of piracy itself was shaped, timed, and in some ways ended by a war fought quietly below the waterline, one that almost nobody standing on the deck could ever fully see. Bartholomew Roberts himself would have found the idea almost insulting. This was a man the newspapers of his day called Black Bart, a captain whose crews had raided the coast of West Africa, ravaged shipping lanes off Brazil, and terrorized fishing fleets off Newfoundland, all under a black flag he designed himself, showing a pirate standing triumphantly on two skulls. He drank tea rather than rum, insisted on strict discipline among his crew, and by most estimates captured more vessels than any other pirate of the Golden Age, a career built on outrunning and outfighting some of the best-trained navies on Earth. None of that discipline, none of that reputation, and none of that skill mattered on the morning his hull finally gave out from beneath him. The lesson sailors drew from his death was not really about the Royal Navy at all. It was about the ship itself, and the enemy every wooden vessel carried with it from the moment it first touched salt water. Most people who have heard the word shipworm assume it is exactly what it sounds like, a worm. It is not. The creature responsible for sinking fleets and starving colonies is a saltwater clam, a soft-bodied mollusk with a tiny pair of ridged shells at one end of its long body, shells so small they could rest on a fingertip, yet capable of grinding through solid oak like a hand drill through soft pine. Sailors called it teredo, from an old word meaning to bore or gnaw, and the name stuck for centuries before naturalists ever properly classified it. The animal begins life as a microscopic larva drifting freely in seawater, and the moment it finds bare wood submerged beneath the surface, it attaches itself and begins to burrow inward, using those tiny shells like a rasp. Consider what that looked like from above the waterline. A ship's carpenter kneeling on a deck that seemed perfectly solid, running a hand along a beam that had been sound the season before, hearing nothing but the ordinary creak of timber and rope. Beneath his palm, unseen, a maze of tunnels was already threading through the wood in every direction, and the plank he leaned his weight against without a second thought was closer to a paper shell than a structural beam. Sailors who lived through an infestation described the moment of discovery the same way, over and over. A boot or a marlin spike pushing through a beam that looked whole an instant before, the wood crumbling away like the inside of an old apple. Once inside, the animal turns its own body sideways and continues eating forward, lining the tunnel behind it with a thin, protective shell as it goes, growing longer and thicker the deeper it travels. A single timber can end up hosting dozens of these tunnels running in every direction, and because each animal is careful never to break through into its neighbor's passage, the wood on the outside can look almost untouched, while the inside has been reduced to a fragile honeycomb, capable of collapsing under nothing more than the pressure of a closed fist. This is the first great myth this video needs to correct. Sailors of the Age of Sail did not fear shipworm because it looked dangerous. They feared it because it was invisible until it was too late. A ship's hull could appear sound on the outside for months, while the timber underneath had already been eaten to the point of collapse, and captains who trusted a healthy-looking hull sometimes discovered the truth only when the sea began pouring in through a wall of rot that used to be solid wood. In warm coastal water, a single plank of pine could be riddled with tunnels within a matter of weeks, and a thick oak timber could be reduced to a hollow shell within about a year of steady exposure, an astonishing rate of destruction for an animal that most sailors never even glimpsed directly, since it lived and died entirely inside the wood it consumed. The threat was old long before pirates ever existed. Ancient Egyptian sailors coated their hulls with wax in an attempt to slow the damage, a fragile defense against a creature that had likely been consuming wooden vessels since humans first learned to build them. Phoenician and later Greek and Roman shipwrights turned to pitch, tar, and thin sheets of lead fastened over the hull, and warships too fragile for permanent lead sheathing were simply dragged out of the water and stored on land whenever they were not needed at sea, an early acknowledgement that keeping a hull dry was often the only truly reliable defense. None of these methods solved the problem completely. They only bought time, and time against a creature this patient was never a permanent victory. Even later shipbuilders who tried covering the true structural hull with a thinner, sacrificial outer layer of cheaper wood found the shipworm simply chewed through the sacrificial layer and kept going, treating the extra timber as little more than an appetizer before reaching the meal underneath. By the age of exploration, the danger had only grown, because ships were now spending months at a time in warm tropical waters where shipworm activity accelerated far beyond anything European shipwrights had planned for. Popular retellings of early exploration tend to focus entirely on storms, mutinies, and hostile encounters as the great threats facing these voyages, but the ship's log tells a quieter and stranger story. Christopher Columbus learned this the hard way during his fourth voyage, when shipworm damage became so severe that 2 of his 4 ships had to be abandoned entirely, honeycombed beyond any hope of repair, while the remaining 2 limped into Jamaica so badly damaged that Columbus and his crew were stranded there for close to a year, waiting for rescue while their ship slowly settled and sank at anchor beneath them. This was not a battle lost to rival sailors or hostile natives. It was a battle lost to a creature nobody on board could see, fighting a war below decks that the entire expedition never had a genuine chance to win. One entry in a long list of famous voyages, quietly decided by rot rather than by rivalry. For the pirates of the Golden Age, operating almost entirely in the warm waters of the Caribbean, this ancient enemy became a constant and inescapable companion. And understanding how pirates actually lived means understanding how much of their time, energy, and risk was spent fighting a threat that never appeared on any treasure map. A pirate sloop or brigantine left unattended in tropical water could lose several knots of speed within only a few months, weighed down by weed, barnacles, and shipworm damage, working together to turn a fast raiding vessel into a slow, sluggish target. For men whose entire livelihood depended on outrunning naval patrols and catching merchant ships before they could escape, a fouled and wormed hull was not a minor inconvenience. It was a direct threat to survival, and every pirate captain understood that his ship's speed was only ever as good as his last careening. The favored pirate vessel of the era, the small and nimble sloop, was partly popular for exactly this reason. Its shallow draft and simple rig made it far easier to careen quickly on an open beach than a larger square-rigged ship, and its speed advantage over merchant vessels only existed at all if the hull underneath stayed clean. A pirate captain weighing whether to chase one more prize or turn toward a hidden bay for repairs was, in a very real sense, weighing gold against wood. And the wood usually won, because a captain who ignored his hull for too long risked losing not just speed, but the ship itself. Careening itself was one of the strangest and most vulnerable rituals in the entire pirate lifestyle, and it is rarely shown accurately in popular retellings of the era. A crew would seek out a secluded bay, ideally one with fresh water, game, and no prying eyes, and there they would strip the ship almost bare, rowing barrels of powder, food, and plunder ashore piece by piece until the vessel rode high and light in the water. Ropes and tackle were then used to haul the ship over onto its side, exposing one half of the hull completely out of the water, and the crew would scrape away weed, barnacles, and the telltale honeycombed patches left behind by Shipworm before recaulking the seams with oakum and sealing them again with hot pitch. For those days, the ship simply stopped being a weapon and became a wounded animal lying on its side. Torches burned along the beach after dark, throwing long shadows across a hull tipped open to the night air, while exhausted men scraped at blackened wood by lantern light, half of the crew asleep in makeshift camps further up the sand, muskets left leaning against crates rather than in anyone's hands. A single strange sail on the horizon at dawn could mean the difference between a routine repair and a massacre, because there was no way to run, no way to fight properly, and no way to hide a ship lying on its side in the open. The entire process could take days or even weeks, and for the whole of that time, the ship could not sail, could not fight, and could not flee. Cannon sat useless on a tilted deck. Crews were often scattered on shore, exhausted, drunk, or simply careless, because after weeks at sea, a beach with fresh water and no immediate danger felt like the safest place in the world. It rarely was. This vulnerability shaped pirate strategy in ways that had nothing to do with treasure or reputation. Islands were chosen as pirate havens not purely for their hidden coves or distance from patrol routes, but specifically because they offered safe beaches for careening, hidden enough that a fleet or navy ship could not surprise a crew mid-repair. Nassau's rise as a pirate stronghold, so often explained purely in terms of weak colonial government and a welcoming population, also owed a debt to its geography, since the surrounding waters offered exactly the kind of sheltered, careenable shoreline that a working pirate fleet needed to survive month after month. A spot with fresh water, fruit, and wild game nearby was considered ideal because a careening crew could be stranded and helpless on that same stretch of sand for days or even weeks at a time. Even the notoriously ruthless Samuel Bellamy, captain of the ship later known for its treasure wreck, once forced the captured crew of a merchant vessel to do the exhausting, filthy work of careening his own ship for him, a job so unpleasant that his own men were apparently glad to let captives handle it instead. The task took the unlucky prisoners roughly 2 weeks of scraping and scrubbing beneath a hull crawling with the same creature that was slowly destroying every wooden vessel on the ocean, pirate and merchant alike, hauling away rotten sections of plank, scraping barnacles by hand, and working under a hull tipped precariously on its side above them. It is a detail rarely mentioned in popular pirate stories, yet it captures something true about the era that no sword fight ever could, since even the most feared captains on the water were, for days at a stretch, reduced to nothing more than shipwrights fighting a slow and thankless war against rot. The consequences of neglecting this work were not simply theoretical, and sailors of the era described infested ships in language closer to horror than mere maintenance complaint. A badly infested hull was sometimes called a floating coffin, riddled with so many tunnels that a man could reportedly punch through the remaining timber with his bare hand. Such a vessel might look whole from the deck while being, in truth, only a thin outer shell holding back the sea. Merchant crews and naval officers alike lived with the quiet knowledge that the ship beneath their feet might already be failing in ways no one topside could detect, and that knowledge bred a particular kind of anxiety that had nothing to do with weapons, weather, or enemy sails on the horizon. What makes this story more than a curious footnote to pirate history is the sheer scale of damage the Shipworm inflicted on nations far beyond the Caribbean. And here, the story grows into something closer to a hidden force behind naval power itself. Some historians point to shipworm damage as a contributing factor in the eventual failure of the Spanish Armada in 1588, arguing that vessels weakened while waiting in Portuguese and French harbors were already compromised before the fighting with England's navy ever truly began, though the full causes of that campaign's collapse remain debated among historians and cannot be reduced to a single explanation. Far less debated is what happened in the Netherlands roughly a century and a half later, when a population explosion of shipworm in the 1730s began devouring the wooden pilings that held back the sea itself. Dutch inspectors walking the coastal defenses that year described pulling their walking sticks out of pilings that should have taken a hammer to dent, watching the wood crumble away in their hands like the ash of a burned log. A defense that had stood for generations against wind and tide fell apart at a light touch, one piling at a time. And word of the failing seawalls spread through coastal towns faster than any single storm ever could. Because a storm was a threat the Dutch understood. A slow, invisible collapse of the walls meant to stop the ocean altogether was something else entirely. Dutch coastal defenses, built from timber for generations, were discovered riddled through with tunnels, weakened to the point of imminent collapse, and the nation faced the very real prospect of catastrophic flooding, not from a storm or an enemy fleet, but from a mollusk quietly eating its seawalls from the inside. The crisis forced an enormous and expensive national effort to replace timber defenses with stone, a decision driven entirely by fear of a creature most people had never even seen. The scale of that fear was not exaggerated. Centuries later, in an American harbor entirely unconnected to piracy, the same species would prove just how relentless it could still be, destroying an average of roughly one major wooden pier or wharf every 2 weeks for a stretch of about 2 years after arriving in unusually vulnerable waters, an economic disaster that would eventually be measured in the tens of millions of dollars annually across the country. The lesson those 19th and 20th century engineers learned the hard way was the same lesson pirate captains had already absorbed 2 centuries earlier without ever needing a laboratory to prove it. Wood submerged in salt water was never truly safe, no matter how thick, how new, or how well built the vessel resting on top of it happened to be. For naval power specifically, the turning point came in the 18th century, when the Royal Navy began fastening thin sheets of copper to the underwater hulls of its warships, a technique known as coppering. The original purpose was defensive, an attempt to finally outlast the shipworm that had plagued wooden fleets for centuries, but the unexpected side effect proved far more consequential. Copper sheathing also prevented the buildup of weed and barnacles that slowed ships down over months at sea, meaning coppered vessels stayed faster, cleaner, and more maneuverable for far longer between repairs than the ships of rival nations still relying on older methods. For several crucial decades, this gave British warships a real tactical advantage in speed and readiness, one that historians studying the era's naval dominance increasingly recognize as more significant than it was ever given credit for at the time. Before copper became standard, naval reports from the era described the damage in blunt and alarming terms, with officers writing home that the worms in certain waters had taken a serious toll on a ship's wooden hull after only a handful of years at sea, language that reads less like a maintenance note and more like a warning about a slow, ongoing siege. Coppering did not eliminate the need for careening entirely, since a ship's rudder fittings, seams, and any patch of exposed timber remained a potential opening, but it changed the balance of the fight for the first time in centuries. A defense against a nearly invisible clam ended up reshaping which flag ruled the waves, a connection almost nobody standing on a gun deck at the time could ever have expected. Return then to that morning off Cape Lopez, because the full picture makes Bartholomew Roberts's death far stranger than a simple story of bad timing. Roberts commanded one of the most feared and successful pirate operations of the entire Golden Age, a man who had outrun, outfought, and outwitted colonial navies across 2 oceans for years. Yet in the end, it was not a rival captain's cunning or a storm's fury that placed him in the path of a Royal Navy broadside. It was the same slow, patient, invisible creature that had been quietly working through the Golden Age of piracy from its very beginning, forcing every captain on every ship, hero and villain alike, into the same repeated ritual of exposure and vulnerability on some forgotten tropical beach. The most feared pirate on the ocean was, in the end, undone not by a stronger enemy, but by the ordinary maintenance schedule that governed every wooden vessel afloat. A schedule set not by admiralty law or pirate code, but by the appetite of a clam. There is something almost uncomfortable in recognizing how much of naval history, piracy included, was shaped by a creature too small to notice and too patient to ever be defeated outright. Empires rose and fell partly on their ability to manage an enemy that never once appeared on a battle map. Pirates who spent their careers evading warships and betraying rivals were, in the end, just as vulnerable to it as the merchants they preyed on, forced onto the same beaches, exposed in the same way, undone by the same slow erosion of the very wood beneath their boots. It did not care whether the flag flying above it was black or the flag of a king. It did not care how many ships a captain had taken or how many broadsides a navy had won. It simply kept eating, one tunnel at a time, on every hull that ever touched warm, salt water. And every legend of the Golden Age was, in the end, written on borrowed wood that was already quietly failing beneath the ink. Even now, in harbors and shipwreck sites around the world, the same creature continues its work, tunneling through historic wrecks, wooden piers, and forgotten hulls with the same patient indifference it has shown for thousands of years. Marine archaeologists surveying famous pirate wrecks today still find timbers honeycombed exactly the way sailors described them centuries ago. A living link between the golden age of piracy and a threat that never actually went away, only shifted its targets from wooden warships to wooden docks, from careening beaches to modern harbors still lined with pilings the creature finds just as appetizing as it always did. The story of the Shipworm is, in the end, a quiet reminder that the ocean was never conquered by any flag, any captain, or any empire. It was only ever borrowed, timber by timber, for as long as the wood could hold. And somewhere beneath the surface, something small, patient, and entirely indifferent to human ambition is still keeping the final count.